Well, quantization. The basics first. There are 3 different modes implemented: grain, trigger, and both together, grain and trigger. Please notice that the modes trigger and grain and trigger don't work with auto switched on. Of course, they don't. Auto means automatically triggering the filling of the buffer independently from any quantization. And something more to notice. The name of the small window offering different quantization points is called beat. This is somewhat misleading. It should be named bar, as the shown number shows the quantization points per bar, not per beat. Let me show how the grain mode works and how it interacts with the length of the grains and, of course, with the BPM rate of your DAW. A simple demonstration first. The grains are automatically generated, but you cannot hear them. They are not let through to the audio output at once, but held back until your DAW reaches the next quantization point, for example, every quarter note. Then the already generated grains are sent to the audible output. The next example replaces the quarter notes with a short melody. Well, rather a scale than a real melody. The grain length equals the length of half a beat, and the quantization is still adjusted to every beat. I recommend to watch my videos about the buffer again, videos 3 and 4 of this series, to refresh your awareness of the goings on in the buffer if necessary. In the last example, the grains fit perfectly between 2 successive points of quantization. So, what if they didn't? And the beginning and the end of the notes, not the grains, are somewhat dimmed sometimes. Why? Let me reduce the length of the notes to a 16th. What is a quarter of a beat? Type in only 4 notes and leave the rest of the bar free. The quantization points are set to every beginning of a bar. As we see and hear, the short scale isn't played back the same way it is notated. When I stop and start the sequencer again, the playback begins at different notes of the scale, seemingly in a random way. Well, we are in grain mode, not in any of the trigger modes, meaning the generating of the grains doesn't necessarily start at the beginning of bar 1. Grains are permanently generated. Auto is on in grain mode. Grains are permanently generated, even if there is no sequencer running and there is only a very little chance to hit exactly the beginning of a grain when I start the sequencer. For the same reason, the beginning of the playback may be at different times after the quantization point. I reduce the quantization back to 1 beat, and as you see and hear, the playback starts at different times, different points during the empty beat of the bar. A grain cannot be played back before it has reached its end, of course. The grain's length in the last example was always identical with the quantization time, meaning a quantization point at every beat and a BPM rate of 30 and a grain's length of 2000 milliseconds. I increase the length of the grains to 2500 milliseconds now, so that they don't fit between two quantization points anymore, and fill the whole bar with quarter notes by drawing in 3 more scales. Let's listen and watch what happens. The first scale interferes with the second one in a way depending on the point in the scale where the grains are generated. The last recording started with a complete normal scale, followed by a break of silence, followed by a scale in which the notes G4 and C4 overlap, followed by scales in which always the next two notes overlap. Well, let's have a look at the last graph again. And now the modified graph for grain lengths of 2500 milliseconds, what is a quarter of a beat longer than the difference between two quantization points. A grain is played back at the next quantization point after its birth, but not before the grain's end. It has to be generated completely before getting played back. The first generated grain in the drawing, containing C, D sharp, F, G and again C, is played back at the beginning of the third bar. The second grain, containing D sharp, F, G, C and again D sharp, is played back at the beginning of bar number 4. But the first grain is still being played back. It is playing the last note of its content, the C. Therefore, we hear two notes, a C and a D sharp. Not really amazing, isn't it? But yes, it is, because these two grains overlap, these two notes are heard at the same time, even if there is only one grain generator active. But let me finish the explanation of the last graph. In bar number 7, silence occurs. Why? Well, the fifth generated grain ends in bar number 7, so it has to wait until the next quantization point at the beginning of bar 8 to be played back. But the playback of the last grain, the fourth in the drawing, ends already at the second 16th note in bar number 7. There are 3 16th notes of silence. If you don't believe my drawing, well, here is the screenshot of a recording live into an audio editor. What happens when I make the grains not longer but shorter than a period between two quantization points isn't surprising anymore now. There are 4 grains generated between two quantization points, each 500 milliseconds long. All 4 have to wait until the next quantization point, and there, at the next quantization point, all 4 grains are played back simultaneously. When the time between two quantization points isn't an integer multiple of the length of the grains, we get an effect which is the combination of the first discussed situation with grain lengths of 2500 milliseconds and the second one with grain lengths of 500 milliseconds. For example, a grain length of 700 milliseconds. In the last experiment about the grain mode, I'll increase the BPM rate during the sequencer's run. There are no additional explanations necessary anymore, I think, so let's watch and listen. All right, my next item is the trigger mode. In trigger mode, the generated grains are not held back until the next quantization point. The buffer is filled at every quantization point and the grains in the buffer are played back at once. Let me test the little scale in trigger mode. The length of the grains is 2000 milliseconds again and corresponds to the distance between two quantization points. But alas, what's that? We hear only 4 undamaged scales and then, again, we get into a mess. Let me approach the trigger mode by collecting some phenomena first, before it comes to explanations. Therefore, I increase the grain's length to 2500 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds or 1/16th note longer than the difference between two quantization points. There is a little bit more of undamaged audio than before, otherwise we hear the same phenomenon as before. Well, I'm going to decrease the grain's length now, 1000 milliseconds at first, then 500 milliseconds and then only 100 milliseconds at last. Okay, time for explanations. First, starting your sequencer doesn't initiate any trigger impulse. But, of course, when looped, there is a trigger impulse generated from the second time on the sequencer passes across the beginning, or indeed when the sequencer passes the end of the loop. Second, when the buffer is triggered, or rather when the filling of the buffer is triggered, a certain amount of audio is loaded into the buffer and played back. It doesn't matter whether the trigger impulse comes from the manual button or is initiated by passing a quantization point. In tutorial number 4, the second about the buffer, I told about how much audio is loaded and how it depends on the length of the grains. I did some more precise measuring for this video and found the relations shown in the sheet. There is far more audio loaded into the buffer than only a grain's length. And the bad news is, the exact figures don't only depend on the length of the grains, but also on the complete setup of your studio equipment, of your PC. If you are in need of those exact figures, you have to measure them with your studio setup, with your software, with your PC. There is an additional video, number 15a, in this series to show you the way I did the measuring to find out the shown figures. It's not difficult and a little bit fun, at least, as well. It seems that the goings-on can be described by a scheme like that. The scales above represent the audio produced by the sequencer. The light green rectangles, is it light green? I don't know much about the names of colors, are the generated grains, and at every quantization point a part of the audio stream is loaded into the buffer, which is represented by the large black rectangles. And at least the blue rectangles show the grains being played back. And with the shown configuration, grain length 500 milliseconds, every beat one quantization point, and a speed of 30 BPM, the messing up of our scale happens indeed there where the transparent red rectangles indicate. Okay so far, but for the fact that the drawing is misleading. It suggests overlapping audio in the buffer, and that isn't true at all. So we need a little bit of additional explanation to get it right. Always, when the buffer is triggered, the sound in the buffer is pushed ahead. Every new trigger impulse at the next quantization point pushes the buffer's content fast ahead, whereas the sound in the buffer is played back at a lower constant speed. Therefore, a certain note, a certain part of the buffer's content may pass the playback point, which is moving ahead as well, just at a lower speed, several times, as long as the process of pushing ahead and catching up is finished. With different grain lengths, we get different rhythmic schemes because a grain is always played back until its end before any other audible event can mess up our scale. And with very short grain lengths, the amount of audio loaded into the buffer may be less than the span of time between two quantization points. Well, quantization mode, grain plus trigger at last. The grain length shall be 500 milliseconds again, what is one step, 1/16th note at a speed of 30 BPM. The quantization points are adjusted at every beat, every quarter note. I switch to grain mode and the auto button in the vapor window lights up. Auto trigger is activated. I don't want that now and switch auto off. The result is nothing. Of course it's nothing. The quantization mode is grain, meaning no special impulse to trigger the buffer at a certain quantization point, but just playback of automatically and permanently generated grains, but there are no such grains. There isn't anything in the buffer because I switched auto off some seconds ago. Therefore, I switch auto on again to listen what's going on with the grain mode. Now I switch auto off again and change the quantization mode to grain plus trigger. We can think the mode GRAIN+TRIGGER as a grain mode without automatically permanently generated grains, but with grains generated at certain moments, meaning at the quantization points. Let me compare the modes grain and GRAIN+TRIGGER by switching between them to and fro. We hear the, let me call it, polyphonic playback of the at first held back subdued grains of the grain mode, as well as the monophonic, more or less direct playback, only delayed by the length of the first grain after a quantization point we met discussing the trigger mode. I'm going to compare the modes trigger and GRAIN+TRIGGER before I'll talk about the parameters intensity and pattern. I'll just switch to and fro without any commentary. The goings on should be clear by now. All right, intensity now. The parameter is easy to understand. You can adjust how many of the grains are quantized and how many are not. Adjusting it, for example, at 50%, only every second grain is quantized. With two or more generators active, this can lead to nice stereo effects. And let me change the intensity of quantization while the scale is being played in grain mode. And the same in trigger mode. And in GRAIN+TRIGGER mode. Even before I start talking about the pattern creator, it should be clearly said, with all these different parameters and modes at hand, we get an amazing flexibility in creating granular patterns. But I have to admit that even knowing how to exactly plan and compose a granular structure using the quantization functionalities, I do a lot of experimenting instead of calculating and drawing. I set the borders of my experiments and improvisations by calculating and drawing, But in between those borders I don't calculate anymore, but improvise and try. We must not forget, I think, that we are dealing with music enriched by and with the mathematics, but still being music. There should be, let's say, space for fun in the process of composing and producing. Well, the pattern generator now. You can type plus and minus symbols in the pattern window, and every symbol represents a whole bar. A plus symbol applies the above adjusted quantization mode, speed and intensity to a bar. A minus symbol means no quantization for this bar. The effect of the missing quantization depends on the chosen quantization mode, of course. Here is an example showing one bar with an activated modulation followed by one bar with a modulation deactivated. I'll switch between different quantization modes. The patterns can be as complex as you like. The bar which is being processed at a certain moment is highlighted in blue. Or you can choose one of the pre-installed patterns. Alright now, a little bit of fun now after so much of hard work. The PM field, or in more professional terms, the physical model XY field. Those of you who have watched my tutorial number 14 about modulation know already that the PM field serves as a modulation source, taking the X and Y values of the blue light, the so-called ball, as modulation parameters. The PM field is a model of a ball moving on a surface. The curvature of the surface is adjustable using the bowl slider, and the energy of the ball is adjustable using the speed slider. You can move the ball with the mouse by clicking on it and dragging it all around the PM field. When you release the mouse button again, the ball moves away from the point of releasing according to the curvature of the surface and the energy, the so-called speed, you have adjusted. In the written manual, it is called throw in a ball. You can get some nice effects by starting with a low speed or energy, and then, when the ball has nearly come to rest but is still moving a little, increasing the speed again. And that shall be all for today's tutorial. Video 15a is an addendum showing how I measured the amount of sound in the buffer. And thank you for watching. Please consider liking, subscribing and sharing to support my work. It really helps. And by the way, you might even subscribe to one of my other channels, for example, Music, VSTs and more. Or you might have a look at this crazy Music of the Wall channel of mine as well. But mainly, have a great day and a good time.